tarde a todos. Senhor Professor António Nova, reitor da Universidade de Lisboa, Senhor Professor Rui Malhó, vice-presidente da Faculdade de Ciências, Senhora Professora Paula Mesquita, coordenadora do Conselho Científico das Ciências Humanas e Humanidades da Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia, dear members of the jury, Professor Niccolò Guicciardini, caros colegas, caros estudantes, meus senhores e minhas senhoras, tenho o prazer de abrir esta sessão, em qual gostaria de dizer umas pequenas palavras introdutórias e depois passaria a palavra aos convidados da mesa para breves comentários e, finalmente, daria a palavra ao professor Guicciardini. Gostava de começar por dizer que o Centro de Filosofia das Ciências recebeu com muito gosto e com muita honra o convite que foi endereçado pelo professor Miguel Seabra, presidente da FCT, para organizar este seminário previsto no Prémio Internacional de Fernando Gil para a Filosofia da Ciência e que este ano tem como laureado o professor Niccolò Guicciardini e que é o segundo laureado deste prémio. Nós tivemos muito gosto em receber este convite para organizar este seminário por duas razões fundamentais que eu gostava de referir. A primeira é porque se trata de um convite que nos honra, porque reconhece de alguma maneira o lugar que nós ocupamos, que nós procuramos utilizar em favor da filosofia da ciência em Portugal, uma vez que o Centro de Filosofia das Ciências é o único centro de filosofia da ciência exclusivamente dedicado à filosofia da ciência em Portugal. E, portanto, este convite vem ao encontro desta nossa especificidade e daquilo que tem sido o nosso trabalho ao longo dos anos neste campo. A segunda razão é porque este prémio e a possibilidade de participar deste seminário, de organizar este seminário no contexto do prémio Fernando Gil, nos oferece uma oportunidade muito simpática, muito agradável, muito honrosa, de nos associarmos à homenagem mais que justa que, enquanto pessoas ligadas à filosofia, temos que prestar ao professor Fernando Gil. No que diz respeito ao centro, talvez eu agora passasse para o inglês, na medida em que gostaria que os membros do júri pudessem perceber minimamente duas ou três coisas muito simples que eu quero dizer sobre o centro. So, I just told that we are very proud to have the opportunity to receive this seminar because it represents a kind of acknowledgement of our work in the field of philosophy of science, and because it gives us the opportunity to honor the memory of Fernando Gil, which we consider extremely deserving. And concerning the Center for Philosophy of Science, I would just say that it was founded in 2003. We were here 88 members, integrated members, of which 38 PhD, included 9 postdocs, 28 students of PhD students, and 45 collaborators of several areas. One of the main characteristics of this center is its interdisciplinary character of the team. We are indeed very much committed with scientists from biology, from mathematics, from physics, from medicine, from anthropology, and of course from philosophy. And this highly interdisciplinary team has developed the work during these 9 years, inside of 6 research lines which cover the main areas of philosophy of science. One area we call it unity of science. It is concerned with the major problems of science. The other one is philosophy of mathematics. We have a strong group in philosophy of mathematics. We have a very profitable project on Poincaré, and now we are preparing other projects in the area. We also have a very strong group in philosophy of physics with very highly qualified people from physics. I will give just word to Professor Crocker, who is the founder of this research center, and he works in this research line. And we also have a very strong line of research in philosophy of biology, mainly the question of evolution, which has taken our attention in several occasions, when we have published some very important works in Portugal about that, and so on. The work we have done is grounded in two main intellectual heritages. One is Professor Andrade Silva, who was the first old professor of this house, and somehow he has spread the seeds for the interest in philosophy of science. Many of the students and of his students are now professors, and some of them are working in our center. And the other intellectual heritage is precisely Professor Fernando Gil. Four of us have been his students, have made our thesis with him, and the others, even if they were not his students, they recognize themselves in the work, in the philosophical work of Fernando Gil. And this means, in our point of view, two things. This means that we try to keep at the interior of the great philosophical tradition, from Aristotle to Kant, from Leibniz to Frege, from Husserl to René Thom, for instance, and we intend to have a great proximity, a great attention to what is being done, to the problems raised by the contemporary science. And these 2 points, in my point of view, they come directly from the heritage of Professor Fernando Gil. That means that we don't want to close ourselves inside of what would be the technical philosophical discourse, neither we want to be somehow too close, too much close to the work of science. We have to keep a critical distance. We have to keep I would say coming back in order to be able to describe the problems which science puts inside of the philosophical tradition. That is our main, as far as I can say, that is our main concern. To keep this equilibrium, very fragile, very difficult, between the attention to science and the attention to the philosophical tradition. Not too close to science and not too inside the philosophical discourse. To have this intermediate position is something which is, in my point of view, difficult to obtain, but it is somehow the way we see our heritage towards Fernando Gil. Fernando Gil was, without any doubt, the person who in Portugal has inaugurated and has realized in the more powerful way this kind of work. All his work touches very important dimensions, all the important dimensions of human knowledge and science in special. His texts work with great rigor, with great openness, with great erudition, but also with great capacity of creating novelty, the great themes, the great subjects of knowledge, of philosophy of knowledge. I mean the subject and these devices of representation, of categorization, of invention, belief, evidence, and also the objectivity of knowledge by these cognitive effects and practices and disciplinary practices and modes of transmission and Fernando Gil has somehow covers these two areas, both the grounds of knowledge in general and of science in particular, and the role that institutions play in the construction of knowledges. In a word, I would say that Fernando Gil has taught us to think knowledge both in the purity of his processes and in the material shadow of his institutional endeavors. So I will finish by giving the word to Professor Krotke, who is, as I told you, a founder member of this research group, and as a scientist, I come from the side of philosophy and he is a scientist, and I thought it would be very nice to give him the word for some minutes. Professor Krotke.
Vou ser muito breve. Queria apenas dizer que me sinto muito feliz por estar aqui nesta cerimónia de entrega, na fase de entrega do prémio Fernando Gil. Tanto mais que eu me sinto em perfeita sintonia com as ideias mais queridas deste grande pensador português. Eu acredito que a filosofia e a ciência, e em particular a física, devem estar agora, como sempre, como estiveram até desde o início, até há muito pouco tempo, de mãos dadas. E é tempo de que o divórcio entre a filosofia e a ciência seja eliminado e que passem, digamos, a ciência e a filosofia a andar de mãos dadas, pois que é benéfico tanto para a ciência, pelo menos a ciência no sentido dos seus fundamentos, como para a filosofia. Só do diálogo entre as duas modos de olhar para a natureza pode sair alguma coisa que nos permita perceber melhor a física da natureza. Os novos desafios que a ciência presentemente enfrenta, nomeadamente agora que se está a chegar a uma fase em que se tem que enfrentar resultamento complexo e não linear, é preciso arranjar ferramentas novas, ferramentas adequadas e tratar o problema de uma maneira básica, que não é, digamos, o passo seguinte da ciência não é passível de pequenos pormenores, de alterações cosméticas, precisa de facto ser atacada de um ponto de vista básico, e nisso a filosofia pode trazer grandes aportes para o progresso da física. Acho que, portanto, sem a contribuição de um pensamento mais profundo, de um pensamento mais básico, a física não sairá do impasse em que tem estado, pelo menos desde 1927. Embora as pessoas pensem que a ciência tem estado a progredir imensamente, estão a ver de facto alguns aspectos práticos, pragmáticos da aplicação da ciência. A ciência nas suas bases, a física, quando falo da ciência, estou a falar do meu aspecto, conheço melhor naturalmente, a física, a partir de 1927, do primeiro quartel do século XX, praticamente estabilizou. O que estamos a sofrer é as influências desse conhecimento acumulado. E agora temos que enfrentar, esse grande desafio de enfrentar o complexo não linear, a interação relativa em que o período da ação e a reação não são em geral válidos, em que nós possamos praticar uma ação e a reação que resulta pode ter muito pouco a ver com a ação que foi executada, ou seja, uma pequena ação pode dar origem a grandes efeitos, para isso tem que ser enfrentado. E penso eu, como disse, que sem, digamos, o aporte da filosofia, seu modo de pensar, de aprofundar, de olhar, não, esse passo não é possível ser dado. E concluo também, porque temos aqui na nossa faculdade o Centro de Filosofia da Ciência da Universidade de Lisboa, cuja prática é justamente procurar a fusão, a união entre a física e as outras ciências e a filosofia. E era só isso que eu queria dizer. Fico por aqui, obrigado.
Dava agora a palavra à professora Paula Mesquita, coordenadora do Conselho de Ciências Humanas, Ciências Sociais e Humanidades.
Muito obrigada. Boa tarde a todos, magnífico reitor, professor Peço desculpa, professor Rui Malhó, peço desculpa, acabámos de nos apresentar, a professora Olga Pombo e os restantes membros da mesa, dear Professor Niccolò Guicciardini, dear members of the jury, dear members of the public, it is a huge honor for me to be representing the FCT here, one of the entities who attributes the International Prize in the Philosophy of Science, Fernando Gil. I have very brief words of appreciation and admiration for all who are involved in this wonderful event, and homage to Professor Fernando Gil, who was, as many of us know, for many years a much invaluable advisor and friend of the FCT, as well as of philosophy and knowledge. So I would like to congratulate Professor Guicciardini on this wonderful accomplishment and wish you many much happiness with the rest of your work. Thank you very much.
Boa tarde. A professora Olga Pombo já disse quase tudo. I think I'll speak also in English so that all the others understand. I'm here representing the faculty, but I think my presence is a bit biased because I'm also I consider myself to be a collaborator also of the center. I had some previous interactions, so it's with great pleasure that I'm here, and that I think I speak on behalf of the Faculty of Science, thanking everyone for your presence, and I think this is a matter of joy and proud for the faculty. Also a more institutional note, and again, changing back to the Portuguese, although we are an international faculty, but não queria deixar de notar e agradecer a presença do professor António Nova, nosso reitor. Sei que não irá poder estar presente ao longo da cerimónia toda, das intervenções, mas de qualquer forma acho que é um motivo de júbilo aqui para a nossa faculdade ter a sua presença neste evento. Also for me as a biologist, it's also with great pleasure that I see that we have two talks. One is about how the philosophy report us to science, but I think the other one is on a particular topic where the data of, in this case, science is a source, a valuable source for philosophers, and in one of the most interesting issues, which is on the topic of evolution. So just to end up on behalf of CFCUL, thank you very much to all for your presence here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just three brief words. Thank you very much for the presence of all the people invited to speak in this conference. My first word is to thank to Professor Olga Pombo and the Center of Philosophy of Science that has been doing a very, very important work inside the University of Lisbon and outside the University of Lisbon. I have the opportunity to follow up some of the work during this year and last year, also in science and art, in images in science and art, and I believe that it's one of the most important centers that we have at the University of Lisbon and in Portugal, and I want to thank all the work that is being done, and I think it's a very important and stimulating way of thinking, of researching, and the intellectual work that has been conducted through this group and this center. So thank you very much. That was my first word. My second word, it was of course to congratulate Professor Niccolò Guicciardini and all the people involved, the jury and the committee and the Foundation for Science and Technology involved in this award that takes the name of one of the most important Portuguese philosophers, someone that all of the people in this room knows very well. I have met him several times, I know very well his work, and in fact it's a very important recognition to have this award with the name of Fernando Gil. He has been for a long time one of the most inspiring authors, one of the most inspiring intellectuals in Portugal, and it's very important for us to keep his memory with us and to try to give all the prestige to this award. And finally, a third word to say that in these moments at the University of Lisbon, as in all the universities in the world, probably more than ever, probably more than in other times, we need a critical thinking, and we need a critical thinking inside academic freedom. We need a university that is academic freedom, that is built around principles of academic freedom and with principles of a critical thinking. We need to think more critically inside our universities, mainly in these times of crisis, mainly in these times where we don't know exactly where we are going to go, and we need to bring this critical thinking to the university and probably to inscribe this idea and this critical thinking in our way of acting, in our way of doing, in our way of teaching, in our way of doing research, in our way how to govern the university. And in these difficult times, that's probably the only way out that we have, is to have a much stronger critical thinking inside the university, and for this, philosophers, philosophy of science, the way to try to understand what we are doing in terms of knowledge, in production of knowledge, in the transfer of knowledge, in all the possibilities that are open now with the new technologies and with the new ways and the new possibilities of doing. It's very, very important for all of us. And so that's why I did told to Professor Olga Pombo that even if I had other commitments this afternoon, I am very much sorry if I need to leave the science now. I wanted to come here and to say how important for the University of Lisbon is the work that is being done in this Center of Philosophy of Science, and how important is the conference that you are doing this afternoon. Thank you very much.
I must thank, of course, a lot to the speakers. And now we go step further and we begin our session. Our session has two talks. The first one is Professor Niccolò Guicciardini, the winner of the Fernando Prize. We will hear you in a moment. And we had already invited Professor Villarreal it exemplifies somehow our practice of inviting the scientists or first-level scientists for discussing, for having the opportunity to talk with them and to discuss with them the problems which are now in discussion in the levels where science is progressing, especially in the case of evolution. And we will have the talk of Professor Villarreal. It was already invited to this session. And for us it is also another pleasure to have the opportunity to have you both in the same session. So I will give now the word to Professor Fernando Ferreira, who is a professor of mathematics and is a professor of this faculty. He is a collaborator of the Research Center in Philosophy of Science, and is going to make a brief presentation of Professor Niccolò Guicciardini, if you please.
Thank you. Professor Olga Pombo, the head of the Philosophy of Science group at the Faculty of Science, she invited me to introduce Professor Niccolò Guicciardini, and of course it is a pleasure for me to do so. Professor Guicciardini is a professor at Bergamo. He got a first degree in philosophy, then he went on to get a PhD degree in the history of mathematics, and after that he got also a master's degree in physics. So he has been working for 30 years in the history and philosophy of physics and mathematics in the 17th and 18th century, with a particular interest in Newton, I guess. He has been invited to numerous conferences, he has written in numerous articles, he has written, I think, 6 books, last one edited by MIT Press. And before I give the word to him and to his conference, which is entitled Specious Algebra, is fit enough to find out, but entirely unfit to consign to writing and commit to posterity, Newton's publication strategies as a mathematical author. Before I do that, let me just make a brief comment. As people know, more than 50 years ago, C.P. Snow spoke about the gulf between humanities and sciences. The gulf has widened in these 15 years. It's not so much between humanities and science anymore, but it is between humanities and technology. Of course, this is a college of sciences, and the people that work in fundamental parts of science, like in pure mathematics, like myself, or in theoretical physics, on fundamental questions in biology or chemistry, still have an institutional place to work that is relatively protected. Nevertheless, the people that work in history and philosophy of science are in no man's institutional land. They are too technical for the humanities, and they don't do research-oriented stuff for the scientists. So it's a really tough place to be. And this is why a prize like this is important. It's a stimulus.
I can put this one.
As you prefer. I have a few slides, as you know.
Yeah, I know.
You have already
yeah,
uploaded
I have them here.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, just sorry. We can.
So perhaps while we are setting up the computer for the presentation, I will use these few minutes to actually thank all the colleagues that have introduced me today. And I've learned already a great deal. It's a moment in which I would like to thank, of course, well, the Gulbenkian Foundations and the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, and also the University of Lisbon, which is represented by the rector and other distinguished colleagues. And it's a great pleasure to present you a lecture today in this center. I look forward to receive your feedback, because I will be presenting some new ideas. You see, I will talk about a topic that is part of a new research project that I have, which concerns what I would like to call the methodology of the history of science. How should we write the history of the exact sciences? And in a way, my talk will be on the philosophy of history, but perhaps it's too much to say that. It's more about the methodology of the history of science. And so I entertain some hope that this topic is broad enough to interest you and who are involved into practicing at a high level philosophy and history of science. So I guess that this is enough for the presentation, even though I would like to spend more words to thank you. A few words should be also addressed to Professor Pombo for everything she has done to render this lecture possible. So now I will move there, and if there are the slides, okay. If the slides are not there, well, there was a time in which people could give lectures without this, this visual aids, and I think that after all we can even do that without it. My lecture will be 45-50 minutes, I guess. I will occupy 45-50 minutes of your time, and I begin to apologize about that. Speak here. Yes. So, we begin with this lecture, in which I will be advocating an approach to the history of mathematics, which is my field, inspired by the method followed by intellectual historians. So it's quite new for me to talk about these things. It's a first attempt to develop some ideas on methodology. So what time is it? 3:45, so I have to aim at completing my lecture at 4:30 or so. So in the first part of my lecture, I will recall some of the desiderata for intellectual history proposed long ago by Quentin Skinner, whom we see here. You know, he's not famous enough, so I'm citing him in order to promote knowledge about this unknown historian of political thought. He has been working at Cambridge for many years, and he has been an historian of Hobbes, of Machiavellian political thought, and he has been also a philosopher of history of sorts. I will refer to a paper entitled Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas that appeared many years ago, that has been often quoted. Now I take Skinner's rejection of what he called the mythologies of the history of ideas as a proposition that can still be inspirational for historians of mathematics. In the second part, which is devoted to Newton's publication and authorial strategies, I will show how a kind of humanistic historicism inspired by the work of intellectual historians can be pursued in writing in an historical informed way about one of the great giants of early modern mathematics, that is Isaac Newton. In the third part, I will attempt to draw some conclusions. But first, let me say two things about my talk. I will state first that I do not wish to downgrade or reject internalistic approaches to the history of mathematics, which indeed have been and will continue to be of central importance. Second, I will make it clear that my talk is not meant to be a defense of Skinner's dense philosophical ideas on textual interpretation, which are inspired by Wittgenstein and Austin. Here we see Austin, one of the founders of pragmatics, and based in Oxford mostly, and we will refer to some of his ideas. My approach, you know, Skinner refers to Wittgenstein and Austin in a very heavy way. My approach is much more philosophically naive, I know that, and should rather be taken as a methodological reflection on the craft of the history of mathematics carried out by one of its practitioners. So I come to my first part. In the 1960s, Quentin Skinner took position against approaching, let's go back to him, took position against approaching a text as a self-sufficient object of inquiry. This formidable historian of political thought maintained that texts are best understood as linguistic actions embodying what Austin termed
the author's illocutionary intentions. What a difficult word. It means the author's intentions, actually, and advocated the need of situating historical utterances in their intellectual and linguistic context in order to establish the purpose their authors had in mind when advancing their arguments. It is an absurdity, Skinner continued, to regard the contributions of past actors to problems unavailable to them. Too often, as historians, we ask past actors our questions and see what their answers are. Such mythology of doctrines debases history to a pack of tricks played on the dead, as Voltaire would say, that Skinner cites. Skinner writes, quote, "The most persistent mythology has been created by historians working with the expectation that each classic writer will be found to enunciate some doctrine on each of the topics regarded today as constitutive of the subject." Now, these considerations, applicable as they are to the history of political theory, as for instance Peter Laslet's study of Locke's two treatises showed long ago. Peter Laslet showed that Locke wrote two treatises in a very heated political context and read Locke's work as actually a political action that was taking place in the context of the politics of the late Restoration. Now, these considerations at first sight might seem extraneous to the history of mathematics, considering a text as a self-sufficient object of inquiry that can be evaluated in terms of the consistency of the demonstrations enunciated in it, or dealing with the development of a specific doctrine over a long period of time, do not appear too sinful after all in the case of mathematics. And indeed we have seen informed history of the theory of uniform convergence in Weierstrass, or of the development of the integral calculus from Archimedes to Lebesgue. Why not? As Marc Bevier observed in his book The Logic of History, and his words seems to fit particularly well in the case of the history of the exact sciences, an historian, quote, may legitimately be more interested in texts as expression of meaning embodying beliefs than as linguistic actions embodying illocutionary intentions. Now, I make no claim to methodological exclusiveness in my paper in advocating a humanist historicism inspired by Skinner. I keep distance from any attempt to impose one single method in our discipline, the history of mathematics, which thrives because of the fact that it is practiced by scholars equipped with a variety of backgrounds and who adopt different approaches. The logic of a mathematical proofs or the techniques for the solution of a geometrical problems can be studied as independent of the cultural context in which they were conceived, because mathematics possesses a notable stability through time and robustness when communicated between different cultures. Philosophers since Plato's time have found it difficult to explain the source of this feature of mathematical thought. It is this feature, let us call it the portability of mathematics. I will not say the universality of mathematics. I'm not that sure that mathematical truths are universal, but certainly they are portable. You can transfer them from one culture to another, from one period to another period. It is this portability that makes the technical debate on the cogency of proofs developed even millennia ago legitimate, informative, and fascinating. Yet, it is a different approach that I will be advocating today. Let me briefly expand, before finishing the first part, on Skinner's methodology. I shall refer to his seminal paper of 1969 entitled Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas. We find a sustained attack against the mythology of doctrines that we have just considered, that is, the anachronistic search for a doctrine, a systematic reply to our questions in each of the great classics. Think about the historiography on Newton. When we talk about Newton, we look for what's Newton's method, what's Newton's doctrine, all right? We also find in Skinner's paper a scathing critique of other mythology, among which the mythology of coherence and the mythology of prolepsis, Skinner likes to use difficult words, are of particular interest for us. All are historiographic diseases, according to Skinner, which infect the history of political thought. All, we may add, are natural assumptions in the historiography, sometimes a high-quality historiography of the exact sciences. The mythology of coherence consists in conceiving historical criticism as an attempt to supply the text written by classic writers with the coherence they may appear to lack. When it is often the case that classic writers, such as Richard Hooker in Laws, are not altogether consistent or even fail to give any systematic account of their beliefs. The temptation to impose an inner coherence, which it is the duty of the interpreter to reveal, is exacerbated by lack of interest for the proper emphasis and tone of a work. That is for what I would like to call the voice of an author. The style in which he writes, something which can be extremely revealing of the author's intentions in writing and communicating, provided the linguistic convention of his or her age are properly understood. And we will see something in the second part about Newton's mathematical style. The third historiographic delusion after the mythology of doctrines and coherence is the mythology of prolepsis. Prolepsis comes from Lambano, pro-Lambano, it means anticipation. The mythology of anticipation, which we are prone to generate when we are more interested in the retrospective significance of a given episode than in its meaning for the agent at the times. Such mythology is very frequent in the history of mathematics. When, for example, we talk about Descartes' discovery of analytic geometry or Newton's invention of the calculus, aren't we projecting on the mathematical practices of these two giants of the 17th century interests that inform our teaching and research practices as 21st century mathematicians? Such prolepsis or such anticipation is immediately revealed by our usage of terms such as analytic geometry and calculus that were never employed by Descartes and Newton. Newton employs calculus very rarely to refer to his theory. Descartes referred to his theory with different terms. His contemporary referred to Descartes' theory as common analysis, and to Newton's discovery as the method of series and fluxions. So, I am aware that my attempt to relate my own work to Skinner's views on historical method cannot be taken in a very strict and philosophical engaged sense. The history of mathematics has its own requirements, dictated by the discipline it studies, as I said above. Mathematics produces linguistic utterances that show a remarkable stability over time and that can travel almost intact through different culture, as I said above. This said, I think that Skinner's pronouncement can be inspirational for historians of mathematics. They can inspire new research projects and point to questions that historians of mathematics might have ignored, to the best of my knowledge, or underestimated. My talk, indeed, should be understood as a philosophical low-tech, a philosophical naive reflection inspired by Skinner on the craft of the history of mathematics carried out by one of its practitioners. It is my conviction that Skinner's lesson, which so profoundly transformed the history of political thought, and had a notable influence on the history of science in general as well, can still fruitfully be approached by historians of mathematics. The case study I will propose to you in the second part is that of Isaac Newton. And in the second part of my talk, I will focus on the publishing practices for mathematical discoveries that Newton adopted in the 1670s and early 1680s. I took very seriously the idea that this is a specialized seminar, so I will inflict on you some information about Newton's publication strategies in a very specific period of his intellectual biography, right? I hope I will be able to convince you that it is fruitful to regard his mathematical work, Newton's mathematical work, even his masterpiece of 1687, the Principia, as lacking coherence, as fractured and stratified, and thus as revealing tensions that tell us something fascinating about Newton's intention, Newton's agenda, and his anxieties as a mathematical author. In order to perceive Newton's own voice, the proper emphasis and tone of his work, we need to place his mathematical practice into its linguistic context. We need to avoid projecting on Newton's mathematical texts through what we might call prolepsis, disciplinary boundaries, questions, and terminologies that are our own. We need to raise the question of what Newton was doing in saying what he said, since his actions vis-à-vis his contemporaries reveal the relationship he wished to establish between himself as a mathematical author and his readers and acolytes. Indeed, again following Skinner, in order to have access to the author's intention, we need to pay attention to what he may have been doing in presenting his doctrine in the precise form in which he chose to present it. So I come to my second part. Newton began his career, here we see a portrait by Seaman of Newton in his old age, actually. Newton began his career as a creative mathematician in the winter of 1664. When drawing inspiration from Wallace's Arithmetica Infinitorum, he achieved, by sheer guesswork, the binomial series for fractional exponents. As historians of mathematics appreciate very well, this fundamental result was not proved until much later. Newton's path of discovery was based on the unproven assumption that a general form of the coefficients of the binomial expansion valid for positive integral exponents could be extrapolated for negative exponents and interpolated for fractional ones. Here we see a manuscript page, which is dated 1665, in which Newton, you can probably see some tables, and these are the tables of the coefficients for the binomial series that he extrapolates and interpolates in order to find the binomial expansion for fractional and negative exponents. But this interpolation and extrapolation was a lucky guess, and Newton knew it. It was not proven. It was a guess. During his Annus Mirabilis 1665, Newton further delved into unknown territory. One of his main objectives was to develop a method for studying the properties of mechanical, we would say, transcendental curves. We see here a manuscript. It is a bit faint, but it is faint, actually. The manuscript, the ink almost disappeared from here. And here we see, on the left, you might discern a few curves that Newton is studying, and some of these curves are transcendental curves. And in this field, of course, Newton developed what we now call calculus and what he called the method of series and fluxions. What proved crucial in this research was the use of infinitely small magnitudes, which a few years later Newton called moments of fluent magnitudes. Mathematicians in the 1660s had not yet learned how to justify the use of infinite series, the binomial expansion, sums with an infinite number of terms, and infinitesimals, infinitely small magnitudes. The idea that such techniques could be reframed in terms of the method of exhaustion attributed to Archimedes, and that they were therefore safe, was widely held by practitioners of the infinite and the infinitesimals, had to withstand the criticisms of those who despised the cavalier methods of the moderns and praised the beauty and certainty of those of the ancients. The first who came to know about the young Newton was the Lucasian professor Isaac Barrow, that we see on the left of this slide, an outstanding mathematician who was researching into the properties of curves, which he conceived as generated by continuous motion. It is through Barrow's intermediation that a short manuscript tract entitled De Analisi per Equationes Numero Terminorum Infinitas, on the analysis by means of equations with an infinite number of terms, was dispatched to London. The addressee was John Collins, a mathematical dilettante who made a living, albeit a modest one, out of his entrepreneurial activities in the field of mathematical book publishing. This sector was somewhat in crisis because of the depression in the print business caused by the Great Fire of London. But Collins managed to supervise the printing of several books, mostly related to algebra. In this discipline, there was great need for updating what was available on the English market. I'm afraid to say to Professor Gillis that England was quite a backwater in this period, was not the right place to be. Yes, yes. For Newton, getting in touch with Collins meant having free access to a network of mathematical correspondence, and we see on the right a famous book that is constituted by the correspondence between Newton and Collins, and which had a great role during the priority controversy with Leibniz. Getting in touch with Collins meant for Newton being offered the option to print his method of series and fluxions, call it calculus, in a very conspicuous and attractive way, yet nothing came out of it. That is, Collins, when he received the De Analisi from Barrow, this is the copy that is kept at the Royal Society, which was sent in 1669, and this is the first page of the De Analisi that was sent. It is, a work in which Newton presented what? His calculus, what we call calculus, that is his method of series and fluxions, his new discovery. And Newton, through Barrow, sent this manuscript to Collins. Collins wanted to publish Newton's work. The extant correspondence between Newton and Collins reveals much of Newton's changing approach to publishing mathematics in the period from 1669, the year in which Newton was elected Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in succession of Barrow, to the late 1670s. Collins had several proposals for Newton. For example, the work that we are just looking at now, the De Analisi, could be printed together with some of Barrow's work, whose publication Collins was attending. While waiting for Newton's permission that was necessary to publish this stuff, Collins made copies of the De Analisi, and we have good reasons to think that he circulated information about this youthful work by Newton by correspondence with British and continental mathematicians. Reading the epistolary exchange between Newton and Collins that was later actually published, on the right you see that, Reading the epistolary exchange between Newton and Collins, you have to read also not only what is published there, but also the letters that are extant and are kept in several libraries, of course. Reading this exchange leads the historian to follow a zigzag path, whereby Newton at first seemed close to accepting Collins' invitations to print the De Analysi, or even to dispatch him a fresh, more extensive treatise in which he was writing about the calculus, what we call the calculus. As Collins wrote to James Gregory in June 1675, Mr. Newton intends not to publish anything, as he affirmed to me, but intends to give his lectures yearly to the public library. As Lucasian professor, Newton had to deposit his lectures in the library, and if Newton had deposited in the library this manuscript, this would have been accessible to members of the university. So in a way, it would have been a publication of his work. But even this less ambitious project, and Collins implores Newton, he implores Newton to do that. Even this less ambitious project seemed to remain stillborn, as Collins learned from Newton in September 1676. Quote, "Though about 5 years ago I wrote a discourse in which I explained the doctrine of infinite equations," this one, "yet I have not hitherto read it, but keep it by me. I'm not teaching it to my students, and therefore I will not deposit it." Much to Collins' frustration, as times went by, Newton again and again stated his reluctance to print his mathematics. The passage from another letter by Collins to James Gregory, a Scottish mathematician, is famous. Both Newton and Dr. Barrow wrote and alarmed Collins, who was, very fond of mathematics and publishing mathematics, are beginning to think mathematical speculations to grow at least nice and dry, if not somewhat barren. By the mid-1670s, Newton was quite adamant in not allowing his mathematical jewels to escape from his hands. To the few lucky ones who had corresponded with him on mathematical subjects and who had had access to his manuscripts, he ordered silence and secrecy. In October 1676, he wrote to Henry Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society, who, after Collins enjoyed Newton's overtures on mathematics, Newton wrote, "Pray let none of my mathematical papers be printed without my special license." So the question is, which were the origins of Newton's anxieties in printing his mathematical discoveries? A good place to start from is the only publication project suggested by Collins and Barrow that Newton began to undertake, apparently in earnest, in late 1669, early 1670s, before putting it aside as an unfinished draft. The edition of Gerard Kinckhuysen's Algebra, a Latin translation of a Dutch treatise on algebra carried out by Nicolaus Mercator. Newton accepted to provide annotations that would improve and update Kinckhuysen's work. As we read Newton's annotations to Kinckhuysen, we immediately perceive the hand of the great algebraists at work. But at the turn of the 1670s, Newton was beginning to ponder the relationships between algebra and geometry, and as we will immediately see, he began to think that algebra should not be printed. The strange title of my lecture, which is indeed also a strange lecture, is related to this idea of Newton. On this issue, the value of geometry, Huygens' Orologium Oscillatorium, Christian Huygens' Orologium Oscillatorium, landed as a presentation copy on Newton's table in 1673 and exerted a lasting influence. There are good reasons to believe that until his last days, Newton never ceased to recommend Huygens' mathematical method as a model. The Dutch polymath, mathematician, astronomer, etc., showed him how one could carry out cutting-edge research in pure and mixed mathematics by means that were purely geometrical, without any help of equations, infinite series or infinitesimals. It's a bit an exaggeration. In the Orologium, there are infinitesimals from time to time, actually. But the cycloid, a daunting transcendental curve for mid-17th century mathematicians, we have seen the cycloid in one of the Newton's manuscripts before, could be, so the cycloid was tamed with elegance in the Orologium and put to good use in the study of pendulum motion and horology. By the mid-1670s, Newton, having set aside the sloppy treatise by Kinckhuysen, turned to the distant past of mathematical development. He began reading the works of Greek geometers, especially the late compilation of the Alexandrian mathematician Pappos. His ruminations on the comparisons between algebra and geometry associated by the project of annotating Kinckhuysen developed into admiration for the geometrical way. Newton reached the conclusion that the mathematical methods of the ancients were superior as far as beauty, elegance, and conciseness were concerned to modern ones. Over time, this belief was to take stronger and stronger roots in his mind. Newton's admiration for the ancients went hand in hand with his anti-Cartesianism. Newton believed that Descartes, whose mechanistic philosophy he abhorred, had introduced a cumbersome symbolic method into mathematics. And this is what caused him nausea. Newton contrasted the tediousness of algebra to the elegance and beauty of Greek geometry, as revealed in the works of Euclid and Apollonius. He had come to share the then common view that the ancients possess a hidden geometrical method of discovery superior to the algebraic one. This line of research enabled Newton to come up with interesting results in projective geometry. Newton also, it is interesting to note that Newton's fascination with Greek geometry and his disparaging attitude towards modern algebra resonate with the conviction endorsed at least from the mid-1680s that the ancients possessed a superior knowledge of nature and God. Newton contrasted this with the philosophy and religion of recent men as epitomized by Descartes, the modern philosopher par excellence, who had dared to cast a hyperbolic doubt on all past knowledge in order to formulate a new philosophy on completely novel basis. Similarly, Descartes, the mathematician, had dared to state in the Geometry that the ancient geometers did not possess a proper method. Otherwise, something is popping up on my on my computer. What's that? Go away. Right? So Newton began a great admirer of ancient geometers and criticized Descartes for philosophical, theological, and mathematical reasons. Like many of his contemporaries, Newton believed that the history of mankind was that of a regress from perfection to corruption, and that it was necessary to restore a pristine, lost knowledge. Newton, the theologian and philosopher, gazed at the past with as much admiration as Newton, the mathematician. Yet, in his youthful studies, Newton had relied upon innovative symbolic and algebraic methods, such as those of Descartes and Wallis. By the mid-1670s, the tension between modern mathematical practice and ancient exemplars had engendered a feeling of anxiety in Newton's mind, which might partly explain his refusal to print his method of series and fluxions. From the mid-1670s down in the early 1690s, Newton tended to use the register of printing, for demonstrative geometry, and that of scribal publication, manuscript circulation and correspondence for heuristic algebra. As he himself stated according to David Gregory Memorandum, this is the title of my lecture, Specious algebra is fit enough to find out, but entirely unfit to consign to writings and commit to posterity. Newton was proud of his symbolic mathematical discoveries: the binomial expansion, the method of infinite series, the algorithm for calculating tangents and curvatures, and so on and so forth. But he didn't want to print this method. He could circulate these results in a controlled way via manuscript exchanges and correspondence, but not print this result. Printing those heuristic methods, algebra and calculus, would have aligned Newton with modern mathematicians who had to withstand criticism from the defenders of the rigor and certainty of classic geometry. Such a polemic would have been lethal for Newton, who wished to be identified as an heir to the classical tradition rather than a follower of the innovators. Were not his acolytes in the early 18th century referring to him as our great discoverer and restorer? Restoration. Newton is restoring ancient knowledge, ancient methods. He's not a modern. He did not conceive himself as a modern, but as an heir of the ancients. Further, let us also take into consideration the fact that in the 1670s, Newton engaged in a fierce polemic with some fellows of the Royal Society, and especially Robert Hooke, on the new theory of light. This interesting polemic between Newton and Hooke had also to do with the role of mathematics in natural philosophy. Newton claimed that his natural philosophy was certain because it was mathematical. But in order to profile himself as the philosopher who could surpass the kind of mitigated probabilism of experimental science defended in texts such as Hooke's Micrographia, via the use of mathematics, Newton had to avoid becoming embroiled in a polemic concerning the certainty of mathematical methods, as had happened to Wallis, whose methods stood so much at the root of Newton's use of infinite series, his proof of the binomial theorem that we have just seen. So what happens here is that at the Royal Society, people like Boyle and Hooke were saying, well, we can reach on the probability in natural philosophy. You cannot be certain. We have to be skeptical about the results of natural philosophy. And Newton disagreed. Natural philosophy could be carried out with certainty via the use of mathematics. And that is why being embroiled into a polemic on the certainty of his mathematical method might have been very difficult for Newton. Studying Newton's publication strategies is a challenging task. It might be too much to say that the above-mentioned extra mathematical factors caused Newton to reject Collins' publication proposals in the 1670s, or to avoid the explicit use of algebraic methods in the Principia. These extra mathematical factors I referred to above are, I recall you, anti-Cartesianism, so I am against Descartes, therefore I am against algebra, admiration for the ancients were geometers, therefore I am a geometer, and a desire to overturn the mitigated skepticism in vogue with the Royal Society, the idea that we can reach only probability and not certainty. Rather, one might say that it was a number of philosophical ideas and political concerns that propelled Newton's polemical reading of Descartes and the modern philosophers. That these concerns, together with Newton's tense dealing with the Royal Society, like force vectors, pointed Newton's mind away from the prospect of committing to print his symbolical, rather Cartesian, modern, and uncertain mathematical discoveries, such as the discovery of the binomial theorem, for instance. It is based on symbolism algebra, infinite series, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that these extra mathematical factors caused Newton not to print his mathematics, but pointed his mind away from doing that. An important element in my defense of a kind of humanist historicism inspired by Skinner, and I come to my brief conclusion, is the rejection of any attempt to define Newton's thought and behavior as governed by causal law. Newton's approach to publication is far from being coherent, and the historical record does not afford us any simplistic description. Yet, his dealing with Collins, Oldenburg, and later Halley during the publication stages of the Principia, as well as with Wallace, reveals something of Newton's authorial strategies, of the way in which he wished to profile himself vis-à-vis his contemporaries, of the role he attributed to himself as a rediscoverer of ancient exemplars and the defender of an anti-Baconian way of envisaging the relationships between mathematics and natural philosophy. But ultimately, we must accept that the late publication of Newton's early mathematical writings that occurred in the early 18th century during the polemic with Leibniz is also the result of contingencies, such as the depression in print caused by the Great Fire of London, Collins' death, and the publication conventions in England under the Restoration, an age in which scribal publication flourished. My objective today has been to reveal the voice of a mathematician for whom mathematics was a discipline that played a considerably different role from the one we are accustomed to attribute to it nowadays. This is an author whose questions concerning the elegance and antiquity of methods are specific of his cultural context, and who framed replies to these questions that sometimes lack systematicity and coherence, or even often stand in contradiction to his mathematical practice. Today, I have described the style of Newton's published and unpublished mathematical writings, and these publication and authorial strategies as the expression of philosophical, religious, and political agendas. The admiration for the ancients, the anti-Cartesianism are certainly embedded into political and theological debates. I have sought to study Newton's mathematical text as revealing, even in their more technical details at times, Newton's intentions in writing mathematics, as revealing his response to anxieties that concerned the politics and philosophy of his own times, rather than as anticipating our own version of Newtonian dynamics and calculus. Indeed, in order to achieve my aim, I had to pay attention to Newton's activities, to what he was doing and saying, to his anti-Cartesian philosophical agenda, and his polemical engagement with the ideology in vogue in the Royal Society in the 1670s. In doing so, I might dare to say that I've sought to write the kind of cultural history delineated long ago by Skinner. Thank you very much.
I think I'll be going to Portable. Yes, so I made it in 45 minutes. That's done. You know that there is Guicciardini, yes.
Is open to have some questions?
Yeah.
of your lecture. So, it seems to me that the strategy you depicted was not entirely coherent in the case of Newton, not only because of the Principia that he published later, but for example, he was caring for his own mathematics, for what he considered to be important to print for the posterity to let printed, and not in general for what others would have printed. A case in point is what is his attitude vis-a-vis the data he wanted very much to have and to publish in connection to his theory of the moon. And he acted in this respect, let's say, terribly vis-a-vis Flamsteed, the royal astronomer. In fact, he threatened Flamsteed that if Flamsteed wouldn't give him his data to publish, then he would lose his pension. Now, Flamsteed was applying the strategy of Newton. In fact, he wanted to be sure about the objectivity and correction of his data before he published. But Newton was in a hurry, for these data were essential for him, for the theory of moon. And he extracted the data from Flamsteed and published them. So how do we explain this?
Now, I dealt with what Newton did in the 1670s and 80s. I said at the beginning that I was focusing on this period. In the case of Newton, it is always important to have a synchronic idea of what he did. You know, he was not always coherent, of course, and I encourage, at the beginning I said that we have to avoid, I don't know if you were here at the beginning of my lecture, so I said that we have to avoid, following Skinner, the mythology of coherence. What is the mythology of coherence? It's the idea that we have to extract a coherent doctrine from an author. We have to define a classic.
Response to anxieties that concerned the politics and philosophy of his own times, rather than as anticipating our own version of Newtonian dynamics and calculus. Indeed, in order to achieve my aim, I had to pay attention to Newton's activities, to what he was doing and saying, to his anti-Cartesian philosophical agenda, and his polemical engagement with the ideology in vogue in the Royal Society in the 1670s. In doing so, I might dare to say that I've sought to write the kind of cultural history delineated long ago by Skinner. Thank you very much.
I think I'll be going to Portability. Yes, so I made it in 45 minutes. That's done. You know that there is Guicciardini, yes.
your lecture. So, it seems to me that the strategy you depicted was not entirely coherent in the case of Newton, not only because of the Principia that he published later, but for example, he was caring for his own mathematics, for what he considered to be important to print for the posterity to let printed, and not in general for what others would have printed. A case in point is what is his attitude vis-a-vis the data he wanted very much to have and to publish in connection to his theory of the moon. And he acted in this respect, let's say, terribly vis-a-vis Flamsteed, the royal astronomer. He in fact, he threatened Flamsteed that if Flamsteed wouldn't give him his data to publish, then he would lose his pension. Now, Flamsteed was applying the strategy of Newton. In fact, he wanted to be sure about the objectivity and correction of his data before he published. But Newton was in a hurry, for this data were essential for him, for the theory of moon. And he extracted the data from Flamsteed and published them. So how do we explain this?
Now I dealt with what Newton did in the 1670s and 80s. I said at the beginning that I was focusing on this period. In the case of Newton, it is always important to have a synchronic idea of what he did. You know, he was not always coherent, of course, and I encourage, at the beginning I said that we have to avoid, I don't know if you were here at the beginning of my lecture, so I said that we have to avoid, following Skinner, the mythology of coherence. What is the mythology of coherence? It's the idea that we have to extract a coherent doctrine from an author. We have to define a classic with algebra and calculus secretly. I work publicly, but I circulate my ideas in manuscript form, not secretly perhaps, but I will not commit myself as an author with a print publication. Well, this idea, this strategy is still present in Newton's theory of the moon because of this contrast between Newton's working notes and his printed work.
Making me understand in English. Myself understand in English. Alan Chalmers published a book a few years ago on atomism. I wonder if you are aware of it. And he says in this book that Boyle and Newton, against Descartes, didn't try to unify his natural philosophy. And mostly Boyle, that I know a little bit better. I didn't work Newton, but it is for sure that Boyle still kept alchemist ideas and ideals dealing with the chemical philosophy and with medical methods and so on, and never tried to unify them around corpuscular philosophy. Mm-hmm. And I was asking if Newton ever dealt with medical problems, corpuscular theory in a systematic way?
That's a second very interesting question. I'm very happy about the feedback that I'm receiving. Actually, I am rather surprised to find so often Newton in his manuscript dealing with the phenomena of life. From the very beginning of his studies, Newton was very interested in perception, volition, muscular motion, and so on and so forth. This is an aspect of Newton that has not been studied enough. I'm afraid I haven't studied yet as a historian of mathematics, but it is certainly a crucial theme in Newton's intellectual biography. The, again, anxieties that Newton had concerning this theme, in my opinion, this is my impression, have a lot to do with his concerns about the relationships between soul and body. In the so-called Trinity Notebook that Newton penned in 1664, and that has been edited by Maguire and Tammany, you will find that Newton reads Hobbes' De Corpore, and he raises objection. I mean, in his annotation, he says, well, how can I memorize things? How can I move one arm? Explain that to me. I don't understand. So, to be hypothetical about it, I'm not that sure, but I think that Newton's study of matter theory was also motivated by this anxiety concerning mechanicism and corpuscularism. The idea that matter is endowed with a vegetative spirit, as Newton said, is endowed with life. A kind of vitalism is present in some of Newton's ideas concerning matter. For instance, in his chemical researches, or call it alchemical researches, Newton studied what we call dendrites, the formation of crystals that resemble vegetables, let us say so. And he talked about these researches as revealing the vegetation of matter. A manuscript that is very interesting is a letter that Newton wrote in 1675 to Henry Oldenburg, and it's entitled An Hypothesis Concerning the Nature of Light. And in this long letter that was read at the Royal Society, Newton deals with ether theory, and he begins, to talk about optics, about light, but then he shifts to describing the presence in the world of this elastic fluid. And then he says, well, we have nerves that communicate, they are full of ether, and they communicate to the sensorium, which is in the brain, our sensations and so on and so forth, and it is via this elastic fluid that we perceive and that we act on muscles. So perception and volition are explained via this subtle active spirit, and Newton is talking a language that is very close to the language of alchemists in this case. And it is in this context that Newton draws the analogy between the spectrum of colors and the musical scale, because he says, well, it is because of the analogy of nature that vision and the hearing must be related one to the other, because we perceive a reality. So it seems to me that Newton is not strange. It is very often the case that Newton is defined as a very strange person. He is a man of his times, and in his times, Boyle as well, and others were scared by the consequences of mechanicism, of Cartesian mechanicism, that were drawn by people like Hobbes, that were defining, volition and perception in purely mechanical terms. And Newton was, I think, worried about this new philosophy. Again, he, profiles these ideas as belonging to the moderns, and he is, reading perhaps also neo-Stoic texts as revealing wisdom concerning matter that is more compatible with a Christian idea of the relationships between soul and body and so on and so forth. Even though Newton was quite heretic, of course.
Totally naive question, but would you say that Newton's strategies then are dictated by his research topics, so that's mathematician, or by his peers at the time? So, for example, if you compare that with other people that have other struggles to publish their own research work, like Darwin, for example, would you say that the strategy is different?
Yeah, I think I got your question. Perhaps I will try and answer. If I don't answer your question, please protest and ask me something. But I think that I see Newton in the 70s. We have considered what Newton did in the 1670s as a person who has in his hand a new symbolic algebraic method, a new method. He is offered the possibility of printing him and avoids print publication of this method. He likes to circulate this method in printed form, and this question of style is important for Newton in defining his authorial strategy, the way in which Newton wants to be associated to a certain theory rather than to another, to a certain style rather than another. So, is Newton's strategy different from other contemporaries? Is this your question? Are there other contemporaries who follow a different... Okay, perhaps you ask me two questions. So, there is a tension between Newton's mathematical practice and his printing strategy. We have seen it in the case of the theory of the moon. In the Portsmouth paper, you find differential equations. In the printed theory of the moon, you find the most geometrical way to describe the motion of the moon in terms of epicycles. So you cannot imagine anything more archaic, let us say so. Other contemporaries of Newton had a very different approach to publication. Think about John Wallis. John Wallis was a great defender of symbolism and algebra. And he printed his Arithmetica Infinitorum in 1656. And when Fermat criticized the Arithmetica Infinitorum, saying, look, what you are printing here, what you are saying is not serious, is not rigorous. Wallis replied, well, but you should thank me because I am printing, I am rendering public a method of discovery. And we should appreciate mathematicians who render, who make their methods public. So Wallis is doing something completely different from Newton. But I am not sure that I answered your question. So if I did not, protest and ask me your question.
Yes, I was wondering how Newton's publication strategy was related, if at all, to claims on priority, because later these were going to erupt.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that might not have influenced him early on, but what I was wondering is that he seemed to have this double strategy. You can circulate things in manuscript, but you don't print them.
Yeah.
But would circulating a manuscript, would it have been dated? Could he then have said, aha, but I was first because this manuscript of 1664 was circulated? Yeah. I mean, how did it relate to possible priority disputes, his strategy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As a matter of fact, in Newton's times, it was possible to make public claim about a theory by circulating it in manuscript in proper form. For instance, in the Epistola Posterior to Leibniz, Newton introduced anagrams. The purpose of these anagrams was to relate this Epistola Posterior to manuscripts, when you decode, okay, I will explain that to you. In 1676, Newton wrote to Leibniz 2 letters, the Epistola Prior and the Epistola Posterior. In the Epistola Posterior, Newton writes at length about his discoveries, and there are 2 anagrams. When you decode these anagrams, what you find are quotations from a previous work, the Methodist, that had circulated within the circle of acolytes in 1671. So Newton, in a way, was circulating his manuscripts via Oldenburg, who was the secretary of the Royal Society, who kept copies of these letters in the archive of the Royal Society. So these correspondences with Collins and Oldenburg were public correspondences. It was very close to publishing, printing things, because the correspondence that went through Oldenburg, we have seen before the 1675 hypothesis on the nature of light. Well, if you go to the Royal Society, you find this letter in the archives of the Royal Society. So, corresponding via Oldenburg on the calculus, on the method of series and functions, was a way to make it public, to claim priority about this. And in fact, when the priority dispute with Leibniz erupted, it is the correspondence with Collins that was published, together with material that was kept at the archives of the Royal Society. Newton's correspondence with Collins was bought by William Jones, who was librarian of the Earl of Macclesfield. And when the polemic with Leibniz erupted, this correspondence could be used and published in the Commercium Epistolicum that we have just seen in 1713. So Newton did not publish the calculus, but made it known in a circle of acolytes. And this knowledge was used during the polemic with Leibniz for good purposes. But Newton's voice, Newton's style, Newton's way of presenting his mathematics suggested to him, not caused him not to print, but pushed his mind away away from the idea of printing, because printing and putting your name on a book was an authorial commitment that Newton was not prepared to accept. Think about the polemic on the prism experiment, on the new theory of light. Newton printed it, and he discovered how dangerous it could be to print your idea. He says, by the use I've made of the print, I learned that in order to live a quiet life, I have to avoid the printing press. He wrote it, you see. But Newton was proud about his mathematical discoveries in algebra and calculus, and circulated some knowledge about them. When Schirnhausen, David Gregory, John Craig, a certain Leibniz began printing discoveries in the calculus, Newton had to change his strategy. And in the 1680s, mid-1680s and 1690s, we find Newton allowing Wallis to print in his algebra of 1685 and in his second volume of the opera in 1693, bits of the calculus of fluxions. The binomial theorem that we have seen before was published in 1685 in Wallis' algebra. The notation for fluxions was published in 1693 in the second volume of Wallis' opera, but not in a work in which the author was Isaac Newton. Somebody else was saying, well, I received a letter from Newton, and I'm printing it. So the register of correspondence was, in a way, preserved in this printing, in the printing of these things. So you see, Newton had to change. What? Newton had to change his publication strategies in the 80s and 90s considerably because of advances in the calculus, both in England and on the continent. And what he chose to do is to use Wallis, the defender of algebra, as a conduit for letting some of his works printed.
We implied, if I understood well, that Newton was anti-Cartesian and anti-mechanicist. And if this is true, shall we understand mechanicism by the model of the clock, Salzburg clock, for example, for Boyle, but the physical model of the clock or the mathematical model of the mechanisms of the clock? Which is the true mechanicism for them?
For Boyle,
Newton, so.
Yeah. Well, that's a very difficult question. I would say that at first, I'm not that sure about my reply, but it seems to me that Newton distinguished a vulgar chemistry for a more noble or subtle chemistry in his manuscripts. The vulgar chemistry is the corpuscularism in which matter is understood as passive and inert, and in which you take into consideration only the laws of impacts that were mathematized at the mid of the 1660s by Huygens, Wren, and Wallis in their paper in the Royal Society on impacts. Newton conceived, for Newton, this kind of mechanicism is not wrong, but does not explain the whole of the phenomena of nature. Because if matter is inert, and we consider only the vulgar chemistry of impacts between corpuscles, we do not understand optical phenomena, chemical phenomena, the phenomena of life, and we do not understand gravitation, as a matter of fact. Because gravitation is not reducible to a question of impacts. After all, Book 2 of the Principia is concluded in section 9 by what Newton understood, perhaps too optimistically, as a refutation of the vortex theory of planetary motion. So the existence of gravitation, the fact that from phenomena we can derive the existence of a force acting at a distance, is something that refutes the clock image of the world you referred to. Thank you very much for all your questions.
We will, you are invited to take a coffee, and we thank the professor.
I really enjoyed staying in Lisbon, a wonderful town, and I really enjoyed the possibility of exchanging my ideas with you today. Thank you very much.